He said he was lonely, and suddenly, I couldn't pretend I wasn't too. I never thought a simple trip to the bookstore would feel like stepping into another world. The quiet hum of conversation mingled with the soft shuffle of pages, and the warm scent of coffee drifted in from the small café in the corner. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where people came not to rush but to linger. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. I noticed her the moment I entered, the way she leaned over a worn hardcover, her fingers brushing lightly against the spine, as if she were gently coaxing a story from it. She was older than me, maybe in her early 40s, but there was a grace in her posture, a quiet elegance in how she moved. Her hair caught the light in subtle shades of chestnut, and for a moment, I felt like I was intruding on something private and beautiful. I wandered closer, pretending to browse the same section, though I was acutely aware of the rhythm of her movements. She glanced up, just briefly, and our eyes met. It wasn't a look of curiosity or judgment, it was something softer, almost like recognition, though we had never met. My chest tightened unexpectedly, a mix of nervousness and intrigue. The small collision came when we both reached for the same book. Our hands brushed, and a spark, or maybe just an awareness, passed between us. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that made my stomach flutter. "You like Murakami too?" she asked, her voice calm, warm, and just a touch amused. I nodded, fumbling for words I didn't know I'd forgotten. We started talking in quiet tones, leaning slightly toward each other to hear over the faint background music. She spoke with confidence, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes, a subtle shadow of loneliness. I felt it immediately. I wanted to ask her everything, to know what made her laugh, what kept her awake at night, but the words stuck in my throat. There was something about her that made me want to tread carefully, to be present but not intrusive. I noticed how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her fingers lingered on the book's cover before letting go. I felt the warmth of her presence, a quiet steadiness that made me aware of my own restlessness. Sitting nearby, I was acutely conscious of the small details, the curve of her smile, the soft exhales she let slip when she laughed, the way her eyes seemed to hold stories I wasn't allowed to hear, yet. By the time we parted that day, exchanging only names and tentative promises to meet again in the same quiet corner, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and hesitation. There was something unspoken between us, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably magnetic. I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't just chance. It was the beginning of something neither of us could fully understand yet. The next time I saw her, it wasn't by chance. It felt like the universe had nudged us together. The bookstore had grown quieter, the late afternoon sun pouring gold across the wooden floors. She was sitting at a small table by the window, a half-empty cup of tea beside her, flipping through pages with a gentle focus that made her seem untouchable, yet approachable. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should speak, but something about the way her eyes lifted to notice me made the decision for me. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She looked up, surprised, and then a smile softened her features, a smile that somehow made me feel like I had walked into a warm room after a cold day. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit," she said. Her voice was calm, inviting, and there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes, like she already knew I'd lingered in her thoughts longer than I realized. As I settled into the chair, I noticed the subtle details, the faint perfume that clung to her, a delicate mix of vanilla and something earthy, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the table as if grounding herself, the quiet rhythm of her breath. Every movement, every small gesture, seemed layered with meaning I didn't yet understand. We talked. At first, it was small things, books, coffee preferences, favorite authors, but soon, the conversation deepened. I found myself sharing pieces of myself I hadn't told anyone in a long time, the quiet loneliness that sometimes shadowed my days, the restless longing for connection. She listened, really listened, her gaze steady, her hands resting loosely in her lap. There was no judgment, only a warmth that made me want to unfold everything I'd hidden. Her responses were measured, thoughtful, each word revealing glimpses of her own quiet vulnerabilities. She spoke of late nights spent thinking about the paths she hadn't taken, of small regrets she had learned to carry lightly. And as she spoke, I realized she wasn't just graceful on the surface. There was a depth to her, shaped by experience, by life's quiet battles. I felt a pull I hadn't expected, a magnetic curiosity mixed with a growing admiration. As we laughed together over a shared anecdote, our hands brushed lightly on the table. A simple touch, almost accidental, yet I felt a warmth spread through me. My chest tightened, my mind momentarily blank, and I was acutely aware of her proximity, the quiet steadiness she exuded. She smiled again, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a fragile sense of hope, as if maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. When the conversation came to a natural pause, I realized we had spent hours talking, though it felt like minutes. There was a subtle promise in the air, unspoken but undeniable, that this connection wasn't fleeting. I wanted to stay, to hear more, to linger in the soft cadence of her presence, but life called us back to our separate worlds. Yet as I walked away, I carried the echo of her warmth, the faint scent of her perfume, and the memory of those steady, knowing eyes. Something had shifted between us. And I knew, without words, without certainty, that this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, our paths seemed to cross with uncanny regularity. Sometimes it was deliberate, sometimes accidental, but each encounter carried the same quiet tension, the same fragile curiosity that neither of us could deny. I noticed the little things, how she tucked her hair behind her ear, the faint crease in her brow when she was thinking, the way her eyes softened when she laughed at something I said. Each detail pulled me closer, even as the awareness of our age difference whispered caution into my mind. One rainy afternoon, I found her under the awning of a small café, the drizzle streaking her coat. She looked up when she saw me, and a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, warming the chill in the air. "You always seem to find me in the rain," she said, amusement lacing her words. I shrugged, unable to hide the flush creeping across my cheeks. We shared a table inside, hands brushing occasionally as we reached for cups of steaming tea. I became acutely aware of the subtle rhythm of her movements, the delicate weight of her presence beside me. There was a steadiness in her that contrasted with my restless energy, and it comforted me more than I expected. She noticed the way I fidgeted with my cup and lightly rested her hand near mine. Not touching, just close enough to send a quiet signal of reassurance. That small nearness set my chest fluttering in a way I couldn't ignore. Our conversations deepened naturally. I learned about her favorite walks in the city, the music that lingered in her memory, and the small regrets she carried quietly. In turn, I shared fragments of my own life, the loneliness I tried to disguise, the small victories I rarely celebrated. There was a strange vulnerability in opening up to her, an honesty that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Each revelation brought us closer, threading invisible threads of trust between us. I noticed the way she observed the world, how she lingered on a painting in a gallery, how she hummed softly while reading a poem. There was a richness in her experience, a life lived fully yet quietly, that drew me in like gravity. I began to notice myself mirroring her gestures unconsciously, leaning forward when she leaned, pausing when she paused, feeling the subtle cadence of her breath when she spoke. One evening, as we walked along a tree-lined street, our shoulders brushed. Not intentionally, but intentionally enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from her. I caught myself stealing glances, watching her in the soft glow of streetlights, feeling the slow ache of attraction tempered by hesitation. Her hand almost touched mine when she reached to adjust her scarf, and for a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to let our fingers intertwine. That was the crux of our awareness. We were moving closer, inch by inch, heart by heart, yet both of us were acutely aware of the caution that lingered in the spaces between. There was longing, yes, but also respect, for her, for me, for the fragile trust we were building. The slow burn wasn't about urgency. It was about noticing, feeling, and savoring every subtle pulse of connection. By the time the evening ended, I walked away with my mind spinning, replaying every glance, every touch, every pause. I was no longer just aware of her beauty, her confidence, or her presence. I was aware of her effect on me. And I knew, quietly, that this wasn't a fleeting infatuation. Something profound was beginning to grow, delicate yet undeniable, in the spaces where our lives had begun to overlap. It happened one quiet evening, the kind where the city seemed to exhale and leave only the soft hum of distant traffic. I had invited her to my small apartment to look at a few books I thought she might like, and she had accepted with a warmth that made my chest tighten. The air was fragrant with the faint aroma of brewed coffee, mingling with the soft vanilla scent of the candle I'd lit on the table. It was intimate but not suffocating, a space that somehow invited honesty. We sat on the couch, close enough that our knees almost touched. At first, the conversation was light, comments on the books, laughter at the odd titles, but slowly, the air shifted. I could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging between us. Her gaze lingered on me longer than before, steady and gentle, as if she were reading the parts of me I didn't show anyone else. "I don't usually do this," I said quietly, my voice betraying more vulnerability than I intended. "I don't usually let people in like this." She tilted her head slightly, waiting, encouraging, not pushing. Her hand brushed against mine, barely there, just enough to make me acutely aware of the warmth of her skin. "I know," she said softly. "Sometimes the world makes it hard to let people see who we really are." It was the kind of honesty that was rare and frightening, yet oddly comforting. I took a breath, feeling the tremor in my hands as I reached for hers. Our fingers touched lightly, a fleeting connection, yet the electricity in that simple gesture was undeniable. "I've been lonely," I admitted, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. "Lonely in a way I didn't realize until now. And seeing you, it's like noticing a part of myself I'd forgotten." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she rested her hand on mine, letting the warmth linger. Her thumb brushed lightly over my knuckles, slow and deliberate. I felt my chest tighten, a strange mix of longing, fear, and something tenderly fragile. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I know that feeling. I've carried it too quietly. And yet here we are, somehow finding each other." The room seemed to shrink around us, the world beyond the windows fading into soft shadows. I could hear the subtle rise and fall of her breath, and for a moment, the only thing that existed was the small, intimate space between us. Her eyes held mine, unflinching, and I could see the layers of experience, vulnerability, and hope reflected there. She leaned in slightly, not too close, just enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from her. Our foreheads nearly touched, and I felt a heartbeat align with mine. It was an acknowledgement, silent and electric, that we were no longer strangers. That we were standing at the edge of something delicate, something profound. When we finally pulled back, it was with soft smiles, unspoken promises lingering in the air. There were no grand gestures, no confessions shouted into the night, just the quiet understanding that we had opened a door to something neither of us had dared to hope for. The slow burn had reached a tipping point, and we both felt it, a tender, unshakable pull toward one another, tempered by respect, vulnerability, and a longing that words could scarcely contain. After that evening of quiet confessions, something between us shifted, imperceptibly at first, then in ways I could no longer ignore. Our meetings became less about coincidence, and more about deliberately seeking each other's company. There was a new rhythm to our encounters, a delicate balance of attention and space, of words spoken and silences shared. One afternoon, I invited her over to my apartment to cook together. It was casual, ordinary in intention, yet charged with a warmth that made my palms sweat. She moved around the kitchen with ease, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, the soft swish of the knife against the cutting board punctuating our laughter. I watched her, noticing how her hair fell in soft waves around her face, how her shoulders relaxed as she hummed a tune, how the gentle tilt of her head hinted at thoughtfulness and grace. Our hands brushed as we reached for the same jar of spices, lingering just a second too long to be accidental. I felt the warmth of her fingers against mine and the subtle thrum of a heartbeat I didn't want to name but couldn't ignore. She smiled at the contact, a quiet acknowledgement, and we carried on as if nothing had happened, though I knew both of us felt the tiny charge that passed between us. Later, as we settled on the couch with mugs of tea, the light from the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, I noticed how naturally she leaned toward me. We shared stories of our day, jokes, and gentle teasing, each moment layered with familiarity and trust. I found myself wanting to close the small gap between us, to rest my arm along the back of the couch, to feel her presence closer without crossing a line. At one point, she adjusted the blanket we shared, and our knees brushed. That tiny contact, so ordinary in context, made my chest flutter. I caught the warmth of her hand as it lingered near mine, the subtle reassurance that we were both comfortable, and yet aware of the silent tension threading through our proximity. Every glance, every smile, every small touch was a conversation in itself, a dialogue of unspoken feelings. We spent hours in quiet connection, reading, sharing music, leaning close to discuss a song lyric or a line of poetry. There were no grand declarations, no urgent rush toward physical intimacy, just a slow, careful exploration of closeness. I became attuned to the subtle ways she communicated affection, the brush of her fingers over the edge of my hand, the way she rested her shoulder briefly against mine, the soft sigh that escaped her lips when she laughed. By the time the evening ended, we lingered at the door, reluctant to break the spell. Her hand brushed my arm as she turned to leave, a simple gesture heavy with meaning. I felt a warmth that spread through me, a quiet certainty that this was not fleeting. We were building something fragile but enduring, an intimacy rooted in trust, respect, and the kind of gentle affection that leaves an imprint long after the moment has passed. The slow burn of our connection continued, each day layering new touches, new shared laughter, new awareness of each other's presence. There was anticipation now, not urgent, not demanding, but a patient and tender acknowledgement of something deepening between us, one small, meaningful gesture at a time. As our connection grew, a quiet tension began to weave itself between us. The joy of closeness was now tempered by the weight of reality, societal perceptions, the undeniable age difference, and our own insecurities. I found myself hesitating before reaching out, pausing mid-sentence as I wondered if I was overstepping, if my feelings were appropriate. She, too, seemed to carry an invisible weight, a subtle guardedness in her gestures and glances. One evening, we met for a walk in the park. The sky was bruised with twilight, and the distant hum of traffic felt miles away. We strolled in silence for a few moments, our shoulders occasionally brushing. It was comforting, yet the pauses between words grew heavier, filled with unspoken questions. I could feel her uncertainty, the way her fingers tightened briefly around the strap of her bag, the slight downward tilt of her gaze. My chest ached with a longing I didn't know how to voice. "I sometimes wonder if this is complicated," I admitted quietly, careful not to rush the words. "Not because of us, but because of how the world might see it." She looked at me then, her eyes soft, reflective, and tinged with the same hesitation I felt. "I think about that too," she said softly. "But it's more than that. It's the vulnerability, the fear of getting hurt again. And yet, here we are." That acknowledgement created a strange, fragile intimacy. Our hands brushed almost accidentally as we adjusted our pace, a fleeting touch loaded with meaning. I felt the warmth of her hand, the subtle pressure of connection, and the quiet pull of something deeper, something we both wanted but were afraid to claim too quickly. Every glance held layers of emotion, desire, fear, hope, all intertwined. Over the next few days, small misunderstandings added to the tension. She had to cancel a meeting unexpectedly, and I misread her distant tone in a text. I felt the familiar sting of insecurity, questioning if I was imagining more than there was. But then, when we finally met again, the tension dissolved in the warmth of her presence. A reassuring hand on my arm, a soft smile, and the brush of her shoulder against mine reminded me that our connection was real, delicate yet persistent. The slow burn was becoming almost unbearable, not because of lack of affection, but because every touch, every glance, carried more weight than either of us could fully express. There was an unspoken agreement. We wanted to move closer, but neither of us could entirely let go of the caution that lingered in the spaces between us. By the end of the week, I realized that these hesitations were part of the process. The challenges, the doubts, the emotional tightrope, we were learning to navigate them together. Even in moments of conflict or fear, there was trust, and in that trust, a quiet reassurance. Our connection wasn't fleeting. Every hesitant step, every small touch, every lingering glance was teaching us patience, resilience, and the profound depth of something worth holding on to. The tension remained, yes, but it was no longer frightening. It was a reminder that what we were building mattered. And despite the uncertainties, I found myself drawn irrevocably closer, unable to ignore the truth that we were, in our own quiet way, becoming something more than friendship. That small gesture, the intimacy in its simplicity, carried the weight of everything we had shared, the confessions, the hesitations, the subtle electric current of emotions that had been building between us. "I'm glad we didn't rush," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "It feels right this way." I nodded, my hand gently covering hers. "Every moment led us here," I replied. "And I wouldn't change a thing." We talked then, openly and honestly, about everything we had felt and feared. Our conversation flowed naturally, laughter mingling with the serious tones, each pause a comfortable silence rather than an absence of connection. When our eyes met, I saw reflected there the trust, affection, and quiet devotion that had grown steadily over weeks. It wasn't dramatic, it was real, steady, and profoundly intimate. Eventually, the night drew on, and we lingered on the couch, shoulders touching, fingers intertwined. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for words to define what we felt. The warmth of her hand in mine, the steady beat of her heart against my chest, and the soft brush of her cheek near mine were enough. In that quiet, shared space, I realized that the slow-burn romance we had nurtured had reached its natural and beautiful conclusion. We parted later that night at the door, a gentle hug that lasted a beat longer than polite, a soft squeeze of the hand, and a lingering gaze that said more than words ever could. The emotional tension had resolved, replaced by something enduring, a connection rooted in respect, trust, and a love that had grown slowly, carefully, and meaningfully. As I closed the door behind her, I smiled to myself. The loneliness that had shadowed both our lives felt distant now. We had found in each other not just companionship, but an intimacy that was gentle, profound, and completely ours. The slow burn had finally blossomed, and it was perfect in its quiet, human way.